Hi everyone. Brian and I are back again, and this session is going to be a special session because last time we talked a little bit about passing in a data source directly, but we want to take this B virtualization for infinite scrolling in Blazor to the next level. We want to offer more APIs, more capabilities beyond what the native component can offer. And as usual, I'm joined here with my dear friend Brian. How are you, Brian?
Hi everyone. Hey,
All right, and a sleepy cat in the back. I don't know what he's doing. So anyway, Brian and I have been having a lot of conversations, around, where do we want to take our component next, right? And just for the people out there that you know haven't been or have been in little or just trying to see how people around the world discuss, design ideas and all that. I usually use a little tool called Draw.io. Draw.io helps me kind of illustrate the ideas that I'm trying to make, and it helped me a lot because, you're gonna be working, if you're a software engineer, you're gonna be working with people from all over the world, all different backgrounds, all different ideas. And if you draw a shape, you let their minds translate what that means instead of you trying to find the right word in the language you're speaking, especially if it's not your native language. You don't have to do that work. You're just saying, here's a shape and here's what we're thinking, and people immediately get the idea. So I'm going to share here what I talked to Brian about a second ago. So Brian just, was just talking to me a second ago about, where are we taking this B virtualization model first? If you think about this, is it virtualize or virtualization, the native one that we're
Vir-
using?
virtualize.
Virtualize.
Yeah,
If this is the native component that we're putting a wrapper around, and then we're going out there and saying, okay, let me put a wrapper around that guy. And this wrapper is going to be the B virtualization, the component that Brian and I have been working on. And so, okay, so this is B virtualization. And we want to expose more than what the component, like right now, the virtualize API is a little bit too hard to understand. Like, let me show you guys what I'm talking about here so you just understand before I go back to the screen. If you go into the component here, you have to kind of figure out, understand what items provider result is. You have to understand what an items provider request is. You have to do some mapping. You have to do some work. Excuse me. I want this to be simple. I want you to just be able to pass in an asynchronous call with your conditions, with just a little bit of dictation, on the information that the component needs, without you having to learn about any new component, without you having to learn about any new API or anything. You just the component itself only responsibility is not to leak models into your existing system, but rather use or leverage as much as possible primitive types or native models that you can leverage so you can pass in, you influence the component. You pass into the component as a generic component the functionality and the capability that you want the component to use to be able to pull that data and work with it. This is the kind of the mindset, behind this. And if I go back to the drawing here, this is basically what we're doing. We have basically uh, three different capabilities that we want to offer outside of the box, right? There's the synchronous call. There's the data source. This is an iQueryable, of T. That's just a straightforward data source that you're passing in. No magic there, no problem, right? That's number one. Number two, which is more interesting, is that remember how we were talking earlier about we wanted OData to be able to be integrated with the bVirtualization, and then we thought about it a little bit and we said, why don't we just pass a func async, right? And let the person designing the system determine what's going to be called underneath that system. So if I'm going in here and I'm saying, I have a broker and I have a service and I have a component sitting in here. And this broker is communicating with some, exposing a function that's communicating with some OData component. So it's my broker here, and that's your component. So you're using your component here, and that's your base component. And that component is wrapping up the B virtualization component that Brian and I are working on. So that base component is wrapping up B virtualization, and then my component is using the base component. So this is B virtualization, and then this is base, and this is component. and then you have in here a service, and you have here a broker. Now here's the magic of this. If we design it this way, what happens? If we design it this way, what that means is that whether that broker is talking to a GraphQL or OData or whatever resource, whatever that resource may be, for all I care, what matters to us is that this service is going to expose a certain functionality in here. Let's say retrieve T or data. And this component only responsibility is to pass in retrieve data to the base component, which will pass it to bVirtualization. So this way, what are we having here? If we decide at any point in time to switch from OData to Graph to API to whatever we want to switch to, it doesn't matter. But also, more importantly, it follows the engineering standard in terms of abstracting away all these dependencies and making sure that the layer that's in the middle that's doing all the integrations is ours. It's a local code that is test driven, that is not dependent or reliant on any of the models that are out there. That's basically the mindset. So the third function here was basically func, just a simple function. It's not asynchronous or anything, but it basically allows you to pass in where you stand and the next step and the count, and it basically, excuse me, it basically works with that. And then, before we jumped into that discussion, I was just talking to Brian about, before I jump to that, Brian, do you have anything to add on top of all of this?
No, unless you want me to start talking about what we discussed about.
Yes, go for
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
So if we're going to present three different sort of interfaces, my son and I were sort of discussing different ideas of how we could do that. And one way was to present all the different parameters on one component and maybe a enum to select which way we're going. But I said, well, why do that? Why not just break it up into three different subcomponents or maybe two subcomponents that have very similar parameter sets? I can see how the bottom two have a very similar parameter set and the top one being completely different. So if we broke it up into two components that we supply in the library, one for iQuerybles and one for functions, I just thought maybe that would be an easier way for users to use the library. That's all.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And would these components have like two different names?
yeah,
Like,
yeah. To
okay,
make it clearer, make it clear what they do. Yeah, they're
I
different.
love it. I
Yeah.
love it. The other suggestion was to use an enum and basically switch, but I like what Brian is talking about. I like how it's pure. Basically, it's not kind of let me because if if we rely on enums, that basically means every time we wanna add a new way to pass in the data, we're gonna have to go and add a new enum type and add a new implementation. That's literally how you create spaghetti code.
Hmm.
Instead, every component has its own kind of flow, completely. And I love that idea. I am a big, big fan of that idea. So, what should here comes the hard one. What should
No.
what should we call it? This is the tough part.
Mm,
What should we call this? Should I call it something like I know this? Let's see.
mm,
So you can go here and say this is a B virtualization, and then I don't want to say like for the other component B virtualization async because that's not how you call components, right?
mm.
It's gonna have to have a different name, right? And I'm just trying to think here, what could be a good name for that? B virtualization. Um, let's see here.
I'm lost here on the names. I'm terrible with names.
I wish, I wish there was a way we can basically like have two components with the same name but different parameters, like an overload for the
Mm.
component. That would be sick. That would be pretty cool. This could also work if you give the components different namespaces, so they can have the same name, but they come from different namespaces,
So
right?
they import a different library namespace before they.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's one option. We can do that. So it would be But that'll confuse people a little bit because people will go and say, I don't understand. I'm doing bVirtualization just like you.
Yeah, and
But
it was working before, and it's not working anymore. And yeah.
like I'm seeing Brian on the YouTube channel saying, "Hey, let's go ahead and build that bVirtualization component." And he's passing, I swear I saw him passing in a function.
Mhm.
And when I try to pass a function, it says pass in an iQueryable. These guys are playing with me.
Yeah,
So
it's throwing an error. This function doesn't exist.
this function doesn't exist. What are these people talking about? You know, so there are these two options. I'm just wondering, like, I really like the idea of having two different components. Um, and
Yeah,
also, go ahead, go ahead.
easy for me when I started. It was just OData. What would they call it? Blazor OData client. It was easy.
It was simple. The world was a better place. Didn't have to think about too many names.
No, just mash a few together. I was good.
We should we should we should call it grid helper. Anyway, bVirtualization, huh. The the namespace idea could work. It could work, but it's a little deceptive. It's very
Yes,
hard for
I
people
don't
to.
like it. I don't like it for that reason. No, I
It's
think,
very deceptive. And
yeah.
if we use enums, you know, then our code becomes really, brittle and very hard to maintain because you're gonna have if the enum is, data source, then use this. If the enum is this, and people are just gonna be really confused. I want it to be, fluent and easy. So let's see here. Should we call it something like B external virtualization versus B virtualization? That's weird.
Mm.
It's a little weird.
So what are you trying to explain there?
External meaning you're going to be calling an API or something, but it doesn't have to be an API because you could pass in an asynchronous function that's just doing a retrieve list async from a database, right?
Mm.
How is that any different from a data source, right?
Yeah.
Unless you want to change the name. And here's the thing, yeah, like about the components with different options, you're gonna have to keep it super generic, super duper generic, unless we do something, Brian, and this is the other thing that I'm just thinking about, which is that let me share my screen here. My thought here is that if we if we basically go in here and say like, you know, we could have a parent component, and that parent component determines based on some input which component it goes to, right? So these two are still separate, right? Like
Uh,
this one, go ahead.
how's that solving a problem? We're still got to we're kicking the can down the road, because eventually those parameters are still got to come in from somewhere.
Right, but now you're kind of combining the best of the two worlds. Like you're going here and saying, okay, I'm not really handling the responsibility of using the data source or the function. Yet, like this would be virtualization source. Sorry, bVirtualization under data source, and this will also be bVirtualization under asynchronous. But this one here would be a bVirtualization component that just does the mapping, the orchestration. You know what I mean? Like all it does is that people pass in like still enum based, but it's not really doing the work. It's just passing it down to whichever component it wants to.
Does it have to be enum based? We could just then have the three different inputs and have a bit of logic to validate the inputs that
Uh,
they're only using one.
what if they pass both?
No, that would throw an error.
If they pass both, you throw an error.
It's a bit like there's So when you use a render fragment, you can have uh, what do you call it? Child content.
Yeah.
But if you don't, if you want more than one render fragment, you can't use child content. You have to, well, you can use child content, but you then have to explicitly say that you're actually using the child content when you're using the markup. If you want to use it in combination with other render fragments.
Mm.
So
Mm.
I've seen some components have logic in them that detects if you're using child content, you can't use this. If you're using that, you can't use child content. So and it throws an error. So
But that means you have to check.
mm,
You have to check, right?
yeah. And where what you're suggesting with the enum is it forces you. Mm.
The reason why I'm saying this is that this is back to what Brian and I were talking about earlier. I've seen this model in some of the third-party libraries. Syncfusion does this all the time. If you look at their data grid, they go in there and say, hey, what kind of adapter are you going to be passing in, right? So if you're doing custom binding versus going in here and saying, let's see here, um, they have their way of saying, they even have like a, let's say, data adapter. So you have the thing called OData, OData adapter. So you pass in the SF data manager, and it goes and says adapters OData adapter. If you notice in here it says it's custom. See? Adapter, custom adapter from the same SF data manager. Versus here, they say, oh, give me OData, and I'm gonna work with it, right? Obviously, just like I said, from a design perspective, design decision perspective, it's I don't necessarily recommend, like, if you're gonna have your UI component call an API directly, something is wrong, right? Because your component should have enough layers of abstraction, at least in an n-tier architecture, right? Where you can verify that these calls are happening. Otherwise, there's no way for you to test drive this. It's going to be really, really challenging and hard. And if you want to add anything, as little as one tiny thing of support to this, some people might love this approach if they're building like a very thin layer, but you still have to have brokers or adapters or clients of some kind that you have to communicate with. This guy says, give me the URL and I'll take care of it. Sounds great. Sounds great, Brian, when it comes to demos. But if you're
Hmm.
building enterprise applications that are willing to expand and all that, doesn't help you a bit, not even in the slightest.
I
So
agree.
this,
I
mhm.
totally agree. But do we need to cater for the person that doesn't?
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, so here's the deal. The thing about UI components, that's a great question that you just asked. I'll tell you why. I do build some of my components to carry out a certain practice.
Hmm.
If you in this case here, you're basically going and saying, okay, here's the deal, you're gonna either pass me the actual function, the OData enabled API endpoint, right? And that means you're cutting out all that n-tier stuff and you're just doing your own thing, or you're gonna pass me an asynchronous function, and whatever you're doing in that asynchronous function, it could include calling that URL.
Hmm.
So it's much more generic than going and saying, just give me a URL, right? I think it's how do you make your software carry a particular practice? Anyway, I'm not phasing out the actual renaming, idea though. I'm gonna go back to this guy just to bring us back to this. What do you think, Brian? Any other ideas that we could have?
Uh,
Because
um, yeah, I'm just wondering if we should sort of leave it as an open question. Maybe ask the viewers if they've got some ideas to throw in at this stage. Have a
sounds
pretty
good.
yeah. I've you know people must be looking and wondering how they're going to use it, and they might have some ideas. And
Sounds good. I
mhm,
mean, when Brian and I will leave this question open, you guys. We're almost at the top of the hour.
mhm,
We'll leave this question open for you guys. Just go out there, This is what we're trying to do. We're trying to build a UI component that can support both passing in a data source and passing in an asynchronous function to go and retrieve the data for us instead of flat out data source, right? What works for you? Do you have other suggestions? We have a bunch of suggestions. We can say, we create two different components with two different names, or use enums, or do something about it. I'll leave that question open and let's see if people give us some answers before our session tomorrow. Otherwise, we're going to have to make a decision and
Hmm.
people are going to have to live with it. All right.
And, and then we'll get pull requests.
And then there'll be four. So anyway, that's basically our session today. Sometimes you just have to stop and kind of have a retrospective, to just think about, okay, we went that far, and now we have this wrapper that offers an iQueryable data source outside of the box. It's test driven, it throws the right exceptions. There's no surprises. If anything happens in that component, we can hand it over to you with localized, categorized exceptions, but now we want to add on top of that. We want to add more value on top of that to make it even simpler and easier for you to use the component without any data leakage, native model or data
And that
structure
and that's a
leakage.
fundamental key for me. It's got to be easy to use and easy to set up. That's yeah.
Especially if you're doing rapid development and you're trying to just spin something out. I can't tell you how useful it was for me today. I was trying to work for a client to get a feature done, and just me understanding, that I can just pull in Pretty Blazor and I can just switch states that fast without having to go figure out, oh, when the state is this and that. It helps a lot. Sometimes you're gonna have just to do muscle work, just labor work, where you just have to get it done. There's nothing that you're learning there. You might run into a situation that will get you thinking, but you want to get something out the door as soon as fast as possible. Usually, I just, sometimes I have only a window of 2 hours before I receive the requirement. And people be like, hey, can you get it in 2 hours? I'll be like, I could try. I'm not Doctor Strange, but I'll try. Anyway, I'm sorry, guys. This is just a design and discussion sessions. We're leaving this open just so you guys actually kind of engage with us and see what you have to say. But otherwise, Brian and I are gonna have to kind of take a route tomorrow and move forward with it. What do you think, Brian? Does that
I
sound like?
think that
Did I
yeah,
say did I say Ryan at some point?
no, I've been called all sorts of things. Don't worry.
Anyway, thank you all so much for watching. We'll look forward to your feedback. And as usual, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you, Brian. I appreciate you.